Imagine this, you're standing at the starting line of life, holding a map in your hands. On the map are countless milestones: graduation, career success, marriage, children, financial stability, retirement. Each point feels like a promise. When I get there, I'll finally be happy. And so you run. You run through school, believing happiness is hidden in that next exam result. You run through work, thinking it's waiting at the next promotion. You run through relationships, imagining that one day the perfect person will appear and complete you. But here's the haunting truth. Each time you reach a milestone, the finish line moves further away. What you thought would bring lasting joy quickly fades, replaced by the next chase. It's like running after the horizon. The closer you get, the farther it seems. Most of us live like this, endlessly postponing happiness to some vague future moment. We tell ourselves, I'll be happy when I have more money. I'll be happy when I lose weight. I'll be happy when I buy that house. I'll be happy when people finally see my worth. But have you noticed that when never really arrives? There's an old story about a man who spent his entire life climbing a tall ladder, only to discover at the end that the ladder was leaning against the wrong wall. He reached the top, but he had been climbing toward emptiness. Isn't that how we sometimes live? Chasing and striving, only to find ourselves hollow when we finally get what we wanted. The world conditions us this way. From childhood, we're taught that happiness is something we must earn through achievement, status, possessions. Commercials whisper, buy this and you'll be happy. Society tells us, prove yourself and you'll be enough. And so, like obedient runners, we keep moving forward, rarely pausing to ask, what if happiness isn't somewhere ahead but right here? Think of a child playing in the grass. She laughs at the sound of her own footsteps, marvels at the shape of a cloud, and claps her hands just because a butterfly passed by. She isn't thinking, one day I'll be happy when I grow up. She is already happy, completely, totally, right now, but as we grow older, something changes. We trade wonder for worry. We let stress replace play. We turn our lives into a to-do list, always checking boxes but never feeling complete. And so the present moment slips through our fingers like sand, while we keep our eyes fixed on some distant future that may never come. This endless chase leaves us exhausted. Notice how often people say things like, just a few more years, then I'll finally enjoy life. Once this project ends, I'll finally rest. When I retire, I'll finally be free. But what happens? Retirement comes and they're too tired to enjoy it. The vacation finally arrives, and their mind is still stuck in emails. The weekend rolls around and they're already worrying about Monday. It's tragic, really, because while we're waiting for happiness, life is quietly passing us by. The Buddha once said, do not dwell in the past, do not dream of the future. Concentrate the mind on the present moment. This teaching is not abstract philosophy, it's a call to wake up. Because if happiness is not here, if it is not in this breath, then where else can it be? Picture this, a man sits at a dinner table with his family, but his mind is in tomorrow's meeting. Another woman takes a walk through a blooming park, but her eyes are on her phone screen. They are present in body, but absent in spirit. And because they are absent, happiness slips by unnoticed. We don't miss happiness because it isn't here. We miss it because we're not. There's a story of a monk who was asked, what is the secret of your joy? He smiled and replied, when I eat, eat. When I walk, when I sleep, I sleep. The listener was confused and said, but everyone does that. The monk shook his head, no, most people are elsewhere. When they eat, their mind is already at work. When they walk, their thoughts are already racing ahead. When they sleep, they are still worrying about tomorrow, but I live in the now. This is the heart of it. Happiness isn't complicated. It's not locked away in the future, waiting for us to achieve more. It's woven into the simplicity of this moment, into your breath, into the sound of a bird, into the warmth of sunlight touching your skin. And yet, it feels so difficult to accept. Why? Because our minds are addicted to what's next. We fear that if we stop running, we'll fall behind. We fear that if we don't plan endlessly, life will collapse. But here's the paradox. The more we chase, the less we arrive. Maybe that's why so many people at the end of their lives look back with regret, not because they didn't achieve enough, but because they didn't live enough. They were always preparing to be happy, but they forgot to actually be happy. So, let me ask you, when was the last time you paused, truly paused, and felt the miracle of being alive? When was the last time you savored a moment without rushing to the next? When was the last time you allowed yourself to simply be? Chase has gone on long enough. The finish line you're searching for is not out there, it's here, right now. And if we dare to stop running, if we dare to open our eyes to the present moment, something extraordinary happens. Happiness stops being a distant promise. It becomes a living reality. That's where our journey begins. Because to understand happiness, we first need to see through the illusion of tomorrow, the belief that joy is always somewhere ahead. Once we uncover that illusion, we can finally step into the timeless truth. Happiness has never left us. It's been waiting here all along. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine a desert traveler. Under the scorching sun, he sees a shimmering pool of water in the distance. Thirsty and desperate, he runs toward it, only to find, when he gets close, that it was nothing more than a mirage. This is how most of us live. We chase illusions of happiness, believing that when we finally arrive at the next milestone, joy will be waiting. But just like the desert traveler, what we reach is not water, but emptiness. From the time we are children, the illusion is planted. We're told, do well in school and you'll be happy. Then it becomes, get into a good college and you'll be happy. After that, find a good job, make money, buy a house, get married, have kids, then you'll finally be happy. Step after step, the promise of happiness keeps moving forward, always just beyond reach. It's like someone dangling a golden carrot in front of us. Every time we think we're close enough to grab it, it swings just a little further away. The problem isn't ambition, striving for growth, setting goals, building a better life. These things are natural. The real problem is the belief that happiness lies only at the end of that striving. That belief is the illusion. Think about the phrase we often hear, I'll be happy when. I'll be happy when I get promoted. I'll be happy when I lose 10 pounds. I'll be happy when I meet the right partner. I'll be happy when I retire. But notice the subtle trick in that phrase, it postpones joy. It tells your heart, not now, later, after you achieve something more. And so your happiness is always delayed, always hanging in the future, like a train that never arrives at the station. Buddhism calls this craving or tanha. It's the root of suffering, the endless thirst that convinces us joy is outside, somewhere else, sometime later. We attach conditions to our happiness as if we need permission to feel alive and fulfilled. But when happiness depends on conditions, it becomes fragile. Suppose you say, I'll be happy when I earn 6 figures. You finally reach that income, and for a while it feels good. But soon a new thought appears. Maybe I'll be happier at 7 figures. And the chase continues. It's like pouring water into a cracked cup. It never fills. No matter how much you add, the cup leaks, and your thirst remains. There's a powerful story about a king who had everything: wealth, palaces, servants, endless luxuries. Yet he was restless. He wanted more land, more power, more control. One night he overheard a poor farmer laughing with his family over a simple meal of rice and vegetables. The king grew angry. How can a man with nothing laugh more than I do when I possess everything? He called the farmer and demanded his secret. The farmer replied, My king, I may not have gold or jewels, but I have enough food to eat, a family who loves me, and peace in my heart. That is why I laugh. The king realized then that all his wealth could not buy the one thing he truly craved: contentment. And isn't that true for us too? How often do we mistake comfort for happiness? How often do we think that more possessions, more recognition, or more achievements will finally complete us? But just like the king, we discover that more never ends. This is the illusion of tomorrow's happiness. It tricks us into trading the only real moment we have, the present, for a future that doesn't even exist yet. Think about it. The future is always a projection. It's not real. It hasn't happened. And when it does arrive, it arrives as the present. But if we've trained ourselves to always look forward, even when the future becomes the present, we'll still be gazing ahead, waiting for another tomorrow. It's a cruel game, like running on a treadmill that never stops. But here's the most dangerous part of the illusion. It convinces us that life is a rehearsal. We think, I'll enjoy myself later. Right now, I need to work harder. Later, I'll have time. But later is never guaranteed. Ask those who are elderly sitting in the twilight of life. Many of them say their deepest regret is not what they failed to achieve, but the moments they failed to enjoy, the laughter they didn't savor, the meals they ate in a rush, the days they spent worrying about tomorrow instead of living today. One day, tomorrow will stop coming. And when that day arrives, will we look back and say, "At last, I was happy"? Or will we realize we were waiting our whole lives for a happiness that never came? The illusion of tomorrow's happiness is powerful, but it can be broken. The first step is to see it clearly, to recognize the mirage for what it is. Once you understand that happiness is not something to be chased in the future, but something to be experienced in this very breath, the chains of craving begin to loosen. Because the truth is simple, almost too simple. Happiness is not a destination. It is not an outcome. It is a way of being available to you here and now. So let's pause together. Take a slow breath. Feel the air filling your lungs. Notice the ground supporting your body. Listen to the sounds around you. This moment is life. This is the only place happiness has ever lived. And as we go deeper, we will discover not just why the future is an illusion, but also why the present moment holds the key we've been searching for all along. There's a truth so simple, so obvious, that we often overlook it. Life can only ever be lived in the present moment. The past is gone, the future is not yet here, and the only place we can breathe, love, laugh, or cry is now. And yet most of us spend our days everywhere but the present. We replay old conversations, regretting what we said or didn't say. We project into the future, worrying about things that might never happen. Meanwhile, the present waits patiently for us, like a friend sitting quietly in the corner, hoping we'll finally notice. The Buddha taught that the present moment is the doorway to liberation. Not tomorrow, not someday, now. Every breath we take is an invitation to return home, to rest in awareness, to discover that happiness isn't something we have to chase, but something we can touch at any moment. Think about it. When you're truly present, even the simplest experiences feel alive. Drinking a glass of water isn't just hydration. It becomes a miracle, cool liquid flowing down your throat, refreshing your body. Walking down the street isn't just moving from point A to point B. It becomes a dance of sensations. The feel of your feet meeting the ground, the rhythm of your steps, the breeze brushing against your skin. The present moment transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. But why is it so hard for us to stay here? Because the mind loves to wander. It's restless, always grasping at the next thing. Scientists estimate that the average person spends nearly half of their waking life lost in thought, not paying attention to what's actually happening around them. Half a life gone, because we weren't really here for it. No wonder happiness feels elusive. How can we find joy if we're not present in the very moment where joy exists? Thich, NH letter 1EA5T, H letter 1EA1NH. The beloved Zen master often spoke about this. He said, "The present moment is filled with joy and happiness. If you are attentive, you will see it." Notice his words, if you are attentive. That's the key. Happiness doesn't disappear, it's simply overlooked. It's like the sun hidden behind clouds. The sun has always been there shining, but until the clouds part, we don't see its light. Mindfulness is the act of parting those clouds. It brings us back, gently but firmly, into the only place happiness has ever lived, right here. There's a story of a young monk who asked his teacher, "Master, what is enlightenment?" The master replied, "When hungry, eat. When tired, sleep." The young monk frowned, but everyone does that. The master smiled, "No. When others eat, they are already worrying about tomorrow's hunger. When others sleep, they are still haunted by yesterday's dreams. To truly eat when eating and sleep when sleeping, that is enlightenment." This teaching is both profound and practical. It reminds us that happiness is not hidden in some distant spiritual goal. It's in the simple act of being fully alive to this moment, without dragging the past or grasping for the future. Consider this: when you laugh with a friend, you don't say, "I'll enjoy this later." You enjoy it now. When you watch the sunset, you don't store it for tomorrow. You feel its beauty in real time. That is the nature of happiness. It is immediate. It cannot be postponed. Yet the modern world makes it challenging. Our phones buzz with notifications. Our schedules are crammed. We're always multitasking, always dividing our attention. Even when we try to rest, we're scrolling, distracted elsewhere. But what if, just for a moment, you stopped? What if you placed the phone down, closed your eyes, and listened? You'd hear the sound of your own breath. You'd feel the rise and fall of your chest. And in that simple awareness, peace would emerge. Happiness doesn't need fireworks. Sometimes it's as quiet as a single breath. Let's pause here. Take one conscious inhale. Feel it enter your body. Now exhale slowly. Notice how, even in this tiny pause, there is calm. This is the miracle of the present moment. It requires nothing but your attention, and yet it gives everything. The more we learn to rest here, the more we see that happiness is not something to gain, but something to recognize. It's already within us, like a seed waiting for sunlight. All it asks is for us to return to now again and again. One day, a man asked the Buddha, "What is the greatest wonder?" The Buddha replied, "People live as though they will never die, and they die having never truly lived." That answer is piercing. How many of us are so busy chasing tomorrow that we forget to live today? How many of us postpone joy, waiting for the perfect conditions, when in truth, the only condition we ever need is now? The present is not just a moment in time, it is life itself. And if we miss it, we miss life. So the invitation is clear. Stop running. Stop waiting. Stop postponing happiness for the future. Breathe and step into the present moment. This is where life unfolds. This is where peace resides. This is where happiness exists, always has, always will. And as we explore further, we'll uncover why we keep postponing joy and how that habit robs us of the very life we're meant to live. We humans have a strange tendency. Even when joy is right in front of us, we delay it. We make happiness conditional. We tell ourselves, "I'll be happy when I graduate. I'll be happy when I get the job. I'll be happy when I find love, when I travel the world, when I buy that dream house." It sounds harmless, even motivating, but hidden beneath those words is a trap. That little phrase, "I'll be happy when," is like a thief that steals happiness from today and locks it away in a future that never comes. Why do we do this? Part of it is habit. From childhood, we're rewarded for achieving. Get good grades and you'll be praised. Win the game and you'll be celebrated. Success becomes associated with approval, and approval becomes associated with happiness. Slowly, we internalize the belief, happiness must be earned. So, as adults, we keep applying the same rule. Happiness, we think, belongs not to this moment but to some better version of ourselves. I'll be happy when I lose weight, when I'm more attractive, when I'm more successful, when I'm finally enough. It's heartbreaking, isn't it? Because what we're really saying is, I'm not allowed to be happy now. I must wait. I must improve. I must deserve it first. Another reason we postpone joy is fear. We're afraid that if we allow ourselves to feel content now, we'll stop striving. That if we enjoy the present, we'll lose motivation for the future. But that's not true. Gratitude for the present doesn't kill ambition, it gives it clarity. Think of a gardener. If she only waits for the flowers to bloom before feeling joy, she suffers through the entire season. But if she appreciates each stage, the planting, the watering, the first green shoots, she finds happiness in the process, not just the outcome. And ironically, that joy makes her more patient, more diligent, more alive in her work. Joy in the present doesn't make us lazy, it makes us whole. But still, the habit is hard to break. We keep waiting for weekends, waiting for vacations, waiting for retirement, always postponing life. There's a story of an old man who worked tirelessly for decades, saying, "One day when I retire, I'll finally enjoy myself." But when retirement came, his health had faded, his body was weak, and many of the simple pleasures he once dreamed of were no longer possible. He looked back with regret, realizing he had sacrificed the present for a future that never truly arrived. How many of us are living that same story right now? And then there's another subtle layer, comparison. We look at others and think, I'll be happy when I have what they have. Social media makes this worse. We see curated snapshots of people's lives, the vacations, the relationships, the achievements, and we believe we're behind. So we delay happiness until we catch up. But of course, the finish line always moves. The Buddha taught that comparison is one of the greatest thieves of joy. Because when happiness depends on measuring ourselves against others, it's never truly ours. So why do we cling to this habit of postponing joy? Because it feels safe. If we say, I'll be happy when, we avoid facing the truth that happiness is available now. We push it into the future because confronting the present, just as it is, can feel uncomfortable. But here's the paradox. The present is the only place happiness can exist. If we don't claim it here, we'll never claim it at all. There's a Zen parable about a man being chased by a tiger. Running for his life, he falls off a cliff and clings to a vine. Above him, the tiger waits. Below, another tiger prowls. And then right beside him on the vine, he notices a single ripe strawberry. He plucks it, places it in his mouth, and smiles. That's life. Danger above, uncertainty below. And yet in the midst of it, a strawberry appears. Most of us are too busy fearing the tigers to notice the fruit. But those who dare to savor it, those who choose joy now, discover freedom. The habit of I'll be happy when blinds us to the strawberries all around us. The laughter of a friend, the warmth of sunlight, the comfort of a meal, the sound of rain. We dismiss these as ordinary because we're too busy waiting for extraordinary. But in truth, these are the very flavors of happiness. What if instead of saying, I'll be happy when, we began saying, I am happy now and still moving forward? What if happiness wasn't a finish line but a companion walking beside us? Happiness is not a future event. It is a present choice. The more we see through this habit of postponement, the more we free ourselves to live, not tomorrow, not someday, but today. And once we understand this, we begin to glimpse the path the Buddha offered. A way of living where joy is not delayed, but discovered in every step. If we've seen the trap of postponing joy, the question naturally arises. So where does true happiness come from? Buddhism offers a profound answer, one that has guided seekers for over 500 years. The Buddha's life itself was a testimony to this question. Born into luxury, surrounded by wealth, comfort, and pleasure, he had everything most people dream of. And yet he felt a quiet emptiness. Deep inside, he knew that worldly pleasures could not protect him from the truths of life, aging, sickness, and death. So he left it all behind, not because life in the palace was miserable, but because it was incomplete. He set out in search of a happiness that was unshakable, a joy that would not crumble when circumstances changed. And what he discovered became the foundation of Buddhism, a path that frees us from suffering and reveals happiness right here, in this very breath. At the heart of this teaching are the Four Noble Truths. Life is marked by suffering dukkha. This doesn't mean life is only pain, but that everything conditioned, everything dependent on circumstances carries a seed of dissatisfaction. Even pleasure fades, even success grows old, even relationships change. The cause of suffering is craving tanha. This is the constant thirst for more wealth, more recognition, more comfort. It's the voice that says, I'll be happy when. There is freedom from suffering. When craving is released, peace is revealed. The Buddha did not say happiness must be created. He said it's uncovered, like the clear sky revealed when clouds drift away. The path to freedom is the Noble Eightfold Path, a way of living rooted in wisdom, ethics, and mindfulness. This path is not abstract philosophy, it is a practical guide. It teaches us that happiness is not found in chasing what is impermanent, but in cultivating a mind that is steady, compassionate, and awake. Think of it this way. If happiness depends on external conditions, it's fragile. But if it's rooted in inner clarity, it becomes unshakable. Take mindfulness, for example. When you practice awareness of the present moment, you train your mind to rest. You discover that joy can arise from something as simple as drinking tea, breathing deeply, or watching the rain. You no longer need extraordinary conditions. Ordinary life becomes extraordinary when you are fully alive to it. Or take compassion. When your heart opens to others, happiness expands beyond yourself. Have you noticed that some of the deepest joy comes not from receiving but from giving? A kind word, a gentle smile, a helping hand, these bring a happiness that no amount of wealth can purchase. And then there's wisdom, the understanding that everything is impermanent. Instead of clinging, you learn to let go. Instead of fearing change, you flow with it. This shift dissolves much of life's suffering because you no longer fight against the natural rhythm of existence. There's a story of a monk who lived a simple life, owning nothing but a robe and a bowl. One day, a thief broke into his hut. Finding nothing to steal, the thief grew angry. The monk, seeing this, gently said, "You have come so far to see me. You should not leave empty-handed." He took off his robe and offered it to the thief. The thief, confused, took it and left. That night, the monk sat naked under the moonlight and whispered, "Poor man, I wish I could give him this beautiful moon." This is the spirit of true happiness, not bound to possessions, not shaken by loss, but rooted in a freedom that cannot be stolen. Modern life tells us happiness comes from having more. The Buddha teaches that happiness comes from needing less. Modern life says happiness comes when we control everything. The Buddha shows that happiness arises when we release control and live in harmony with what is. This doesn't mean renouncing all responsibilities or living in a cave. It means shifting the source of joy from external circumstances to inner qualities. When your peace depends on wealth, status, or praise, it is fragile. But when it depends on mindfulness, compassion, and wisdom, it is steady, resilient, unshakable. True happiness in the Buddhist sense is not excitement or constant pleasure. It is deeper than that. It's a quiet contentment, a freedom of the heart, a peace that remains even when storms come. Imagine an ocean. On the surface, waves rise and fall, sometimes calm, sometimes violent, but in the depths, the water is still unmoved. That depth is the mind rooted in the Dharma, unshaken, peaceful, free. And here's the beautiful part. This path is available to everyone. You don't have to be a monk. You don't have to leave your family or career. The practice is as close as your next breath. Each moment of mindfulness, each act of kindness, each step of letting go, these are steps on the path to true happiness. The Buddha once said, "There is no path to happiness. Happiness is the path." The way we walk is not separate from the destination. When you walk with awareness, when you live with compassion, when you breathe with presence, happiness is not something you arrive at, it is something you embody. So if the old habit says, "I'll be happy when," the Dharma whispers, "Be happy now, walk with joy, live with awareness." Because the path itself is happiness and every step is an arrival. And as we continue, stories, both ancient and modern, will reveal how this truth comes alive, showing us that happiness is not distant, but closer than we've ever imagined, slipping past our defenses, touching the heart where pure logic cannot. The Buddha himself often taught in parables, seeds of truth planted in the soil of imagination. Today, let's walk into a few of these timeless stories, each a doorway into the happiness that is already here. There is the tale of a man being chased by a ferocious tiger. Running for his life, he stumbles upon a cliff. With the tiger above and nothing but emptiness below, he clings to a vine dangling over the edge. As if that weren't enough, two mice, one black, one white, begin gnawing at the vine. His death seems certain. But just then he notices a wild strawberry growing on the cliffside. Reaching out with one hand, still holding on with the other, he plucks it and places it in his mouth. Sweet, fresh, alive. For that moment he tastes pure joy. This story is not about denying danger or pretending life is safe. It's about realizing that even in the midst of uncertainty, beauty can be found. Happiness is not the absence of problems, it's the presence of awareness. The strawberry is always there, waiting for us to notice. Another story tells of a king who sought the greatest treasure, a possession so valuable it would bring him peace in any circumstance. He sent messengers across the land, but none returned with what he desired. Finally, a humble monk offered him a simple ring. On it were engraved the words, "This too shall pass." At first, the king was disappointed, but as time went on, the words revealed their power. When sorrow struck, he looked at the ring and remembered that pain would fade. When triumph came, he looked again and remembered not to cling, for joy too would change. In both moments, he discovered a peace that rested not on conditions, but on wisdom. There's also a story from the Buddha's own life. A grieving mother came to him, holding her lifeless child, begging for a miracle. She pleaded, "Please, Lord, bring him back to life." The Buddha, filled with compassion, said, "Bring me a mustard seed from a household that has never known death, and I will restore your child." The woman hurried from house to house, but in every home she visited, she was told of a lost father, a departed mother, a brother, a sister. By the end of her search, she understood. Death touches every family. Her grief softened into wisdom, and though her child was not returned, her heart began to heal. The teaching was not cruel, it was a gift. In seeing the truth of impermanence, she found strength, and in that strength, a kind of happiness beyond clinging. These ancient stories live because they mirror our own lives. Who among us has not felt the tiger of fear chasing us, or the mice of time slowly gnawing at our days? Who has not sought treasures that turned to dust, or clung to loved ones only to watch them slip away? Yet each story points us to the same truth. Happiness is not about eliminating uncertainty or escaping loss. It is about opening our hearts in the middle of it all, tasting the strawberry, remembering the impermanence, discovering compassion. Even in modern times, stories of unexpected joy remind us. Picture a man rushing to work, stressed, late, his mind trapped in the future. Suddenly, a child on the sidewalk smiles at him, an innocent, wholehearted smile. In that instant, the man feels something shift. For a moment, deadlines don't exist. Anxiety fades. There is just connection, raw and real. A simple smile, yet it carries the weight of eternity. Or imagine a woman in a hospital bed facing illness. Each day is uncertain, but she chooses to notice small miracles. The sunlight streaming through the window, the warmth of a friend's hand, the sound of birds outside. Instead of drowning in fear, she drinks from these small cups of beauty. Her body may be fragile, but her spirit glows with strength. These are not extraordinary events. They are ordinary moments, moments we often overlook. But when seen with mindful eyes, they become treasures. Stories like these open the heart because they bypass the illusion that happiness is far away. They remind us that joy is not hiding in the future, it's here, woven into the fabric of this very moment. The Buddha never promised a life without challenges. He offered something greater, a way to meet challenges with a heart that is free. And through parables, through lived experiences, he pointed us again and again to the truth. Happiness is not something we wait for. It is something we awaken to. So when you next hear the whisper of your own mind saying, "I'll be happy when," remember the strawberry. Remember the ring. Remember the grieving mother. Each story is a lantern lighting the path back to now, because the heart opens not when conditions are perfect, but when awareness is deep. And in that opening, we taste the happiness that has been here all along. If stories open the heart, mindfulness opens the door. It is the practice of returning home, home to the breath, to the body, to the miracle of being alive right now. Most of us live like travelers lost in thought. Our bodies are in one place, but our minds are far away, replaying yesterday or rehearsing tomorrow. We miss the taste of our food, the warmth of the sun, the sound of laughter. Life slips by unnoticed, like water flowing through clenched fists. Mindfulness is the gentle art of loosening that grip. It is the invitation to simply be here, to breathe and know you are breathing, to walk and know you are walking, to smile and know you are smiling. The Buddha compared mindfulness to a lamp. In a dark room, everything seems frightening. But light a lamp and the room is revealed as it is, no monsters, just shadows. In the same way, mindfulness illuminates our minds. We see our worries, our fears, our desires for what they are, passing thoughts, not solid prisons. Imagine sitting by a river. Leaves float by on the water. Some are beautiful, some are decayed. You don't need to grab them or push them away, you simply watch them drift. This is mindfulness with thoughts. They come, they go. You remain steady like the riverbank. And from that steadiness, joy arises. Why? Because so much of our suffering comes not from what's happening, but from being lost in what's not happening. The mind says, what if only, someday. Mindfulness says, here, now, try it, feel one deep breath. Inhale, exhale, for a moment nothing is missing. That single breath is life itself, and within it lies a quiet happiness. Mindfulness is not only about meditation cushions or silent retreats. It can be woven into the fabric of ordinary days. When you eat, truly eat. Notice the colors, textures, flavors. A simple apple becomes a wonder. When you walk, truly walk. Feel the earth under your feet, the rhythm of your steps, the sky above. Suddenly, the world feels vast, alive, sacred. When you listen, truly listen. Not to respond, not to judge, but to hear. In that space, relationships deepen, love flows more freely. Science now echoes what the Buddha taught centuries ago. Studies show that mindfulness reduces stress, improves focus, even strengthens the immune system. But beyond science, there is something more profound. It reconnects us with the sacredness of life. One Zen master once said, "Drink your tea slowly and reverently as if it is the axis on which the earth revolves." Imagine living that way, not rushing, not waiting, but fully alive in each sip, each breath, each step. That is joy. But mindfulness is not about chasing joy either. If we sit and think, I must be happy now, we miss the point. True mindfulness welcomes each moment as it is. Sometimes the moment is joyful. Sometimes it is painful. Sometimes it is ordinary. And yet in embracing it fully, we discover a peace deeper than pleasure, a contentment wider than circumstances. Like a mother holding her crying child, mindfulness doesn't push discomfort away. It holds it gently. And in that embrace, even suffering begins to soften. There's a story of a monk who was asked, "What do you do in your monastery?" He replied, "We eat, we walk, we sit, we sleep." The visitor scoffed, "But that's what everyone does." The monk smiled, "Yes, but when we eat, we eat. When we walk, we walk. When we sit, we sit. When we sleep, we sleep. Most people are elsewhere, we are here. That is mindfulness, the difference between living life and merely rushing through it. If you want to taste happiness now, begin simply. Take one mindful breath before answering a message. Feel one mindful step on your way to work. Notice one moment of beauty in your day. These small acts are not trivial, they are gateways. Step through them often enough and life itself becomes your meditation hall. Mindfulness does not promise a life free of storms, but it offers you an anchor. While the winds of change blow and waves rise, you can remain rooted, calm, steady. And in that steadiness you find joy, not fragile, not fleeting, but grounded in presence. So perhaps the greatest gift you can give yourself is this: to return again and again to the present, to awaken to this breath, this step, this heartbeat. For here and only here, happiness waits patiently, like a dear friend who has never left. If mindfulness is the doorway to joy, gratitude and simplicity are the treasures we find once we step through. They are not exotic practices reserved for saints or sages. They are available to every one of us, right here in the middle of ordinary life. Gratitude is the art of seeing. Simplicity is the art of letting go. Together, they transform the way we live, not by adding more, but by revealing the beauty of what has always been here. Think of the last time you paused to feel truly grateful. Maybe it was for a friend who stood by you, or the taste of a warm meal after a long day, or simply the sight of the morning sun breaking through the clouds. In that moment, didn't life feel full? Didn't happiness arrive without effort? Gratitude is powerful because it shifts the focus. Instead of asking, "What am I missing?" it asks, "What have I already been given?" And when you see life through that lens, the heart overflows. The Buddha once said, "Let us rise up and be thankful, for if we didn't learn a lot today, at least we learned a little. And if we didn't learn a little, at least we didn't get sick. And if we got sick, at least we didn't die. So let us all be thankful." It is not the circumstances that bring happiness, but the eyes through which we view them. Simplicity, on the other hand, is the gentle art of releasing excess. Not just physical clutter, but mental clutter, emotional clutter. Modern life often whispers, more is better, bigger is better. But Buddhism reminds us the more we cling, the heavier we become. There's a story of a monk and his disciple traveling together. They came to a river where a woman struggled to cross. The monk carried her on his back to the other side, then continued walking silently. Hours later, the disciple, still troubled, said, "Master, why did you carry that woman? We monks are not supposed to touch women." The master smiled and replied, "I set her down hours ago. Why are you still carrying her?" This is the essence of simplicity, not holding onto what no longer belongs to the present, letting go of grudges, of old stories, of unnecessary weight. In simplicity, the heart becomes light and joy has space to bloom. Gratitude and simplicity are not separate, they dance together. Gratitude says, "I already have enough." Simplicity says, "I don't need more." Together, they free us from the cycle of endless wanting. Imagine eating a simple bowl of rice. To a restless mind, it may seem plain, but to a grateful heart, it is a feast. Each grain a gift of the earth, the rain, the sun, the hands that planted and harvested. Gratitude transforms simplicity into abundance. In our fast-paced world, it's easy to miss this truth. We chase the newest phone, the bigger house, the promotion, the recognition. And yet, how often does that chase leave us more exhausted than fulfilled? The happiest people are not always those who have the most, but those who need the least. A simple life lived with gratitude often brings a joy that luxury cannot buy. Try this. Before you sleep tonight, think of 3 things you are grateful for. They don't have to be grand. Maybe it's the breath that carried you through the day, the smile of a stranger, the comfort of your bed. As you rest in that gratitude, notice how your heart softens, how happiness quietly arises. Or tomorrow, as you move through your day, ask yourself, what can I let go of? Perhaps it's a needless worry, a harsh judgment, or even just the urge to fill every silence with noise. Each act of letting go is a step towards simplicity, and in that simplicity, happiness finds room to enter. There is a Zen saying, when you realize nothing is lacking, the whole world belongs to you. Gratitude reveals that truth. Simplicity allows us to live it. Together, they remind us that daily happiness does not require perfect circumstances. It requires open eyes and an open heart, to be thankful for what is here, to release what weighs us down, to live light, to live free, to live now. So as we walk further, remember this. Happiness is not hidden in grand achievements or distant tomorrows. It is found in the small things, the simple things, the present things. Gratitude and simplicity are the keys, and they are already in your hands. When gratitude softens the heart and simplicity lightens the load, a new vision begins to emerge. Life itself appears different, not as a problem to solve, but as a gift to embrace. This is what it means to live fully. To live fully is not to cram our days with endless experiences, nor to chase constant pleasure. It is to be awake to the miracle of existence, right here, right now. It is to see with fresh eyes, as if the world has been waiting for us to notice. Buddha once asked his disciples, "How long is a human life?" One said, "A few years." Another said, "A few months." Another guessed, "A few days." The Buddha shook his head. Life is a breath, that's all. When we truly see this, not as philosophy but as reality, something shifts. We stop postponing, we stop sleepwalking through our days. Each moment becomes precious because each moment could be our last. Living fully means listening deeply to the sound of rain, to the laughter of a child, to the silence between words. It means walking with awareness, each step a gentle kiss upon the earth. It means tasting food with reverence, as though the universe itself placed it before us. Ordinary moments reveal extraordinary beauty when seen through the eyes of presence. The morning light through a window, the smell of fresh tea, the quiet rhythm of your own heartbeat, each is a miracle we often overlook. But living fully also means opening ourselves to life in all its colors, not only joy but sorrow, not only ease but challenge. To shut out pain is to shut out half of life. The practice is to meet everything with courage and tenderness. A Zen master once said, "The whole moon and the entire sky are reflected in a single dewdrop on the grass." In the same way, the fullness of life can be found in a single moment, if we dare to truly see it. Perhaps this is the greatest shift, moving from a life of seeking to a life of seeing. Seeking always pushes happiness into the future. Seeing awakens us to the happiness already here. Imagine standing before a mountain. A seeking mind says, "I must climb higher to find beauty." A seeing mind says, "Look at the mountain, it is already beautiful." The mountain doesn't need to change. Our eyes do. Living fully is not about perfection. You don't need to be free from mistakes or free from flaws. To live fully is to live honestly, wholeheartedly, aware of each step, each breath. Even missteps, even struggles become part of the dance. It's like music. Silence and sound weave together to create beauty. In the same way, both joy and sorrow give life its depth. Living fully means we stop resisting the song and start listening to it, embracing every note. And here is the quiet secret. When we live this way, happiness is no longer fragile. It is no longer something we must chase or protect. It arises naturally, like a flower opening to the sun. We find joy not because everything is perfect, but because we are present enough to notice that perfection was never the point. Aliveness was. So, what is this new way of seeing life? It is to recognize that each moment is both ordinary and sacred, that each breath is both fragile and infinite, that happiness is not found in another lifetime, another place, another future, but here now, in the simple act of being alive. Living fully is not about adding more days to our life. It is about adding more life to our days. From the beginning, we've been chasing tomorrow's dreams, tomorrow's success, tomorrow's love, believing that happiness waits for us just beyond the next horizon. But as we've walked through these reflections, one truth has become clear. Happiness has never been hiding in the future. It has always been here in the present, waiting quietly for us to notice. The Buddha's teaching was never about escaping life. It was about returning to it, returning to the breath, returning to awareness, returning to the simple, unshakable joy of being alive. When we let go of the endless chase, when we loosen the grip of craving, when we open our eyes with gratitude, something extraordinary happens. The ordinary becomes radiant. The morning light, the sound of laughter, even the rhythm of your own heartbeat, all of it becomes enough. The timeless truth is simple. Happiness is not a destination. It is a way of walking. Each step taken with mindfulness, each act rooted in compassion, each breath filled with awareness is happiness itself. Life will still bring storms, loss will still visit us, change will still unfold, but with presence we discover a joy that is not shaken by circumstance. A joy that does not depend on what we have or what we achieve, but on how deeply we are willing to be here now. Perhaps this is why so many teachers, from the Buddha to modern voices of wisdom, echo the same reminder. Don't wait. Don't wait for the perfect job, the perfect partner, the perfect moment. Don't wait until the conditions line up exactly as your mind imagines. Life is happening right now. Happiness is breathing with you, sitting with you, walking with you. To postpone it is to miss it. To awaken to it is to be free. Think of the strawberry on the cliff, the king's ring, the grieving mother. Think of the monk who set the woman down long before his disciple did. Each story is a mirror, showing us what is possible when we choose to live awake. Happiness is not about what will be, it is about what is. And so the invitation is simple yet profound. Return home, home to this breath, home to this moment, home to the miracle that is your life right now. Because the truth is timeless, unchanging, eternal. Happiness is not in the future. Happiness is now. And as we close this journey together, let this truth settle gently in your heart. Happiness is not something far away. It is already here in this breath, in this moment. If these reflections have touched you, I invite you to walk further with us. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, where each video is a step into deeper presence, compassion, and clarity. Share this with someone you love, someone who might be caught in the endless chase, and remind them too that happiness is not tomorrow, it is now. And if you feel called, leave your reflections in the comments. Your words may be the lantern that lights another traveler's path. Until we meet again, may you walk with mindfulness, live with gratitude, and discover joy in the simple miracle of being alive.